It's a tough one, this. What do you feel when I tell you what we're going to talk about on the programme? Are there any subjects where you... I don't know if you would say you groan inwardly, or possibly you think before we start, and you may have a sort of clue as to what's bubbling around story-wise, but from listening to Nick, and sometimes we do return to similar territory. Is there one that you balk at? Are there stories that you balk at? I mean, depending on where you are in life, conversations about schools will resonate very differently. If you've got children of school age, then school-related issues can feel like the most important thing on the planet, can't they? Especially at the moment. We may indeed be talking about school-related issues after 11. Even I'm now getting a little bit... Don't worry, I will continue to bring you the facts as and when it's necessary, but I do feel a slight sense of... Oh boy, I think once described in a very nice piece as being like an old gunslinger, wearily strapping on his pistols for yet another fight in the context of Brexit. And I do feel a little bit like you look at the jingoistic coverage in British newspapers today. It's all about vaccines, and then you just have a little glimpse at either the scientific journals or how other media are reporting the same issues and the same stories. And there is, even for me now, there's a slight sense of, oh, what's the point? Why, just you believe what Rupert Murdoch's telling you. I can't be bothered challenging it with the truth anymore. But again, that's probably not a conversation for today. As I understand it, the Indian government has now done exactly what Ursula von der Leyen suggested doing yesterday. And against that backdrop, there is a simple statistic that the European Union countries have exported 34 million vaccines. And we, as far as I can tell, and I've got Theo sniffing around trying to get me a conclusive answer to this, we haven't actually exported any yet. But don't let the facts stand in the way of a good invitation to get furious. And then asylum seekers, also on the front pages today. And that, I have to tell you, is a story that I would, I think I balk at. Oddly enough, the front page and the back page of the Daily Mail, about whom I'm going to be largely warm today because they've been rather nice about me for once in print, are both stories that make me think. And remember, a phone-in is I need you to be engaged as well. It's not like doing a news bulletin. But the sex abuse report that has been published regarding the Football Association and the failings, institutional failings with regard to children put at risk and indeed abused by coaches. I mean, it's unbelievable. But there is always a sense with these stories of I'd rather not talk about it, because it can be so harrowing and so grim, and the line between not knowing that it's important to discuss but not wanting you to do what I would be tempted to do, which is just look the other way because it's too unpleasant to contemplate. I tied myself in all sorts of knots at the beginning of this week talking about this explosion of allegation and accusation against schoolboys, particularly in private schools, being made by schoolgirls. And that story is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's still, and again, I don't know whether it's because of the age range that my own children are in, or whether it's just and with the football coaching stuff, whether it reminds me of some of the stuff that went on at the private schools I went to. But it's so tempting to look away. I completely understand that temptation. And I realise that as a listener, you must have it too. So if I'm tempted not to talk about something because I don't like it, you'll be tempted not to listen to something for exactly the same reason. So if you've ever got any advice for me on how to walk that particular tightrope, I'd love to hear it, because I want to talk about asylum seekers today, but I also don't want to. The reason I don't want to is because I don't know that we make any difference by giving you the facts, by telling you the truth. The invitation to feel frightened of foreigners is one of the most potent out there. The invitation to feel frightened of some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, or if not frightened, then just furious about their plight, I think it's almost impossible to navigate. So if you take the two extremes, which would be, I suppose, Angela Merkel's invitation to 1 million Syrians to move to Germany, which seems to have gone quite well, that would be one extreme. And then the other extreme would be what I suspect your sort of Faragist worldview would endorse. Let's not take any at all, ever. How do you move people in between those two posts? Do you see what I mean? If I said to you, should we let in people more or less unchecked who appear to be And the things that we get obsessed about as well, they're all men. Well, of course they're all men. You know, if my family was desperately seeking refuge, I would go and find it and then hopefully be able somehow to send for my family. I wouldn't send my daughters out to try and get us a foothold in France or Germany or Turkey. I'd go myself. And if I, oddly enough, as an older man, I probably wouldn't, because I'd want to stay there and protect them from whatever threats they were facing. So the most obvious people to go would be the young men from any family. But that causes problems as well. And some of those problems, of course, are exacerbated by reality, by real reports of appalling things. But if I asked you what the top 10 refugee-receiving countries in the world were, where do you think we would sit? Just on that very simple question. And then we look at the European issue as well, the European countries that have records or registers of how many refugees they take in or how many asylum seekers they welcome. So I'll do it. Shall I do it in genuine Fluff Freeman style? We'll start at 10. So the calculation here is quite a straightforward one. It is the percentage of a population that is refugees. So the you know what a percentage is. What percentage of the population is made up of refugees? At 10 is Sudan, where 2.5% of the population is refugees, are refugees. They've taken in about 1 million people since 2010, the 6th largest recipient country in absolute numbers. Now they're fleeing conflict in South Sudan. You've also got transit from Eritrea, Ethiopia and Somalia, among others, all trying to flee to Europe. So although it has a 2.5% figure, it will involve and include a lot of people who aren't intending to stay in Sudan. They're hoping to get into Europe or elsewhere. At 9, Sweden. Sweden is an absolutely fascinating country. If I wasn't so lazy, I'd make a documentary about Sweden, because it moves so quickly from being the whipping boy of the far right to being the saviour of the far right. If you ask somebody about, for example, is Muslim immigration or refugees, go back a couple of years and all of the most sort of gristly characters would be shouting about how awful Sweden was. I can remember reading far-right agitators in America who clearly wouldn't be able to point at Sweden on a map, but were absolutely certain that it was the Sodom and Gomorrah of the 21st century. So Sweden was the absolute whipping boy of the far-right. And sadly, when I say far-right, I include many mainstream British commentators these days. And then fast forward, when Sweden was getting it all horribly wrong in the context of lockdowns and COVID in the early days, but the faux libertarians thought that perhaps it was getting it right, suddenly Sweden became the place that we should all be copying. So in the blink of an eye, depending on what misinformation you were swallowing, Sweden went from being the worst place on earth to being the best place on earth. And did any of these clowns pause to wonder how it could possibly be both? No, of course they didn't. So Sweden's at 2.7%. It's got by far the most, well, not by far, that's not fair, the most generous refugee policy in Europe, and it actively welcomes refugees rather than sort of reluctantly shouldering a kind of international responsibility. The problem is, of course, that when lots of other European countries expressed an unwillingness to share this responsibility, the government had to act, introduced a temporary law that limited, this was back in 2015, the rights of refugees to a minimum of what the country had committed itself to through international conventions. Despite all of that, Sweden still receives far more refugees than most European countries. 2.7% of the population. Djibouti, which is a tiny little country, but by dint of that small population size and the 27,000 refugees that have arrived there, mainly from the civil war in Somalia, you're looking at about 2.7%. I'll do a little less detail as I make my way up the top 10, with your permission. Malta comes in at 7. 2.7% of the population of Malta is refugees, partly, of course, because it's very near the coast of North Africa and easy to get to from Libya. I don't know how even to pronounce this country. It's a small island state that often gets boat refugees who are trying to get into Australia, called Nauru or Nauru. The UN Refugee Agency has been highly critical of the agreement Australia has made with Nauru and other countries, and is concerned about the reprehensible conditions that the refugees live under. Australia has now agreed to stop sending refugees there. Priti Patel today, of course, is expected to examine the possibility of sending our asylum seekers and refugees somewhere that isn't here. So Nauru's at 3.2%, Uganda at 3.8%, Liberia 4.6%, Turkey 5.1%, Jordan is 10.7%, and the number one country is Lebanon, where 21.8% of the total population are refugees. Now, let's have a look at some of the other countries that have big intakes. Germany, 1.5%. Ethiopia, just under 1%. America, 0.25%, a total of 838,000 people. Bangladesh, 675,000. Kenya, 470,000. Russia, 449,000. And even Cameroon, 396,000. That's 1.6% of the total number of refugees. And then we will move our attention to Europe. Are you still with me at the back? Germany is the EU country with the most asylum applicants, roughly 473,000 in the year to the end of 2019, which are, I think, the most pertinent figures. Forgive me if there are more up-to-date numbers out there. I shall bring them to your attention when I can. So, France, Spain. So Germany, roughly 110,000 first-time applicants asked for asylum between January and September of 2019. That's 110,000. France, 87,100. Spain, 80,000. Greece, 47,000, which is particularly anomalous because it's not one of the most populous nations. Malta and Greece saw the most applications per capita. So per capita it goes Malta, Greece, Luxembourg, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, Slovenia, Germany, France. So the most asylum applications per capita in Europe starts with Malta, which is top, about 5 applications for every 1,000 inhabitants. Malta, then Greece, then Luxembourg, then Spain, then Sweden, then Belgium, then Slovenia, then Germany, then France. Well, where's the UK? Because even the most cursory glance at Conservative Party rhetoric or newspaper editorials and front pages would quite persuasively suggest that we do way more than anybody else. There's usually that line, of course, about, well, why don't they stop in the first country that they come to? Which is a little bit ignorant of international law, but seductive nonetheless. There is a perception, isn't there? And I'm not criticising you if you've fallen for it, because I could have done as well if I wasn't so boring that I have these kind of figures at my fingertips. We're not even on the... We barely chart on the per capita question. On the totals, I can tell you we're at 32,000. I'll just remind you, Spain 80,000, France 87,000, Germany 110,000. So we already do considerably less than almost all comparable countries. Considerably less. And yet, Priti Patel is almost certainly right when she identifies making life even harder for asylum seekers trying to come here as a vote winner. So I'm going to open up the phone lines, 0345 6060973. Feel free to... I don't know if you can challenge anything you've already heard, because as I say, all we've been doing is counting. But once the... I guess what I want to examine is the question of whether or not any policy would assuage the feelings deliberately stoked up by right-wing politicians and media. Because I don't think it will. See, I don't think even this, if you've got a problem with asylum seekers and nothing I've said has touched the sides, you're still convinced that we're a country that is shouldering way more of its burden than other countries. You can ignore arithmetic, you can ignore counting, focus entirely upon the fear and the fury. I don't think there's a policy on the planet that can fix that problem for you. And I think Priti Patel wants you to stay angry, wants you to stay frightened. I think. I could be wrong. Discuss. Okay? 0345 6060973. And just to get it out of the way early, the idea that because of the geography of these islands, that somehow we're small. That's what per capita means. Okay, you do it according to population. So what are we doing according to how many people are already here? And we're barely on the charts. So by all means, pretend not to understand that and get very cross. But whatever you do, don't ever calculate how much of this country is taken up by golf courses, because then the idea that we're overcrowded will leave you looking even more ridiculous than you do already. Okay, so where does the idea come from that we are suffering more or shouldering more than other countries when we're clearly not? And against that backdrop, I think that they could build, I mean, look what Donald Trump promised to do in Mexico, that literally could build walls around this island and people would still feel that asylum seekers have no place here. Am I right or am I wrong? I suppose all of that was a very roundabout way of saying if you are in the camp that considers asylum seekers and refugees to be a problem we have no business trying to solve, or a part of the planet's problems that we should try to remove ourselves from, if you just hate the idea, all right, let's call a spade, then am I right in thinking that Priti Patel's proposal might briefly entertain you, but actually, even if they are all processed in Papua New Guinea, if a bunch of them still end up coming here, you're still going to be angry and unhappy? Am I right? I just think I am. I don't think there is a policy on the planet that can deal with emotions based on lies. And I haven't even mentioned Brexit. John's in Birmingham. John, what's on your mind?
Hi, James. We did speak once before, actually, about Nicholas Winton's daughter. I don't know if you remember.
John
anyway.
Sloan. Sloan.
Yes,
Sloan. There you go.
John
Look at that. Memory like a steel trap, John. Carry on. You work in the refugee field in Birmingham.
All over the world. I've been in Bangladesh, yes, Mexico, Greece, and currently we're based in Cyprus, which actually didn't come up on your figures, but Cyprus does actually have the highest proportion per capita of refugees in the EU, but it somehow never seems to. That's partly because it's the closest country to Lebanon and Syria, of course, yes, as well. So there are regular.
Complicated status as well, Cyprus, because of course the dispute between Turkey and Greece continues, so that might have something to do with it. The other thing as well, because they're coming out from Turkey and then coming across the border from North Cyprus into. Did you recognise the picture I painted of the UK, a country where the population is convinced that we do way more than anybody else, where actually we do, by most logical measures, way less? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we do very little, which and partly I suppose that is because we're an island. But I mean, if you look at the percentage of refugees that come to the UK, it's very, very small, and we have an asylum seeker, asylum system here, which just is not fit for purpose. I mean, it
well, oddly, you and Priti Patel would agree. Years. You and Priti Patel would agree on that, although not necessarily for the same reasons.
Different reasons, yes. Because I think what happens over here is every single stalling process is brought into it that can be brought in to try and delay people's claim for asylum, hoping that maybe they might go somewhere else or they might leave or something like that. But the whole asylum system, as you rightly mentioned, of course, and this is where the whole thing, kind of falls down with the people that seem to think that have their own ideas, is, the whole thing is covered by the Geneva Convention 1952 of refugees. So, I mean, for instance, this whole thing about the first safe country that you arrive at is where you should claim asylum is completely wrong. It's technically actually the first country where you feel safe.
Yes.
Now, that can be many reasons. You could feel safe because your aunt or uncle or your mother or your father live in the UK.
You speak the language.
And you speak the language. It's where you've been educated, especially when when I go back to the days when I first started in Calais, we had a lot of doctors, nurses, engineers, that their degrees would be acceptable over here once they cracked the language problem, for instance. And this whole thing about sending them to New Guinea or St. Helena, or I've been to St. Helena, actually. It's very nice there, but it's just so out of this world crazy and doesn't make sense. I mean, just the cost of it alone, because most asylum seekers that come to the UK are granted asylum eventually. And the startling factor is that, don't quote me on these percentages, but the ones that aren't granted asylum, once they go to appeal, over 75% of them are then granted asylum.
What would happen if this plan came to fruition, if people who had come here, who'd crossed the channel, and again, the first paragraph of the Daily Mail coverage says illegally, which again is misleading, isn't it? Because if they prove to be genuine asylum seekers, then the crossing of the channel is not illegal.
No, it's not.
Under international or domestic law.
Under the Geneva Convention, just to start off with. You have the right to claim. Yeah.
So what would happen if this came to fruition? So the plan is that the Home Secretary will change the law so that asylum seekers can be sent to a third country, such as Turkey. Ironically, way ahead of us already on the per capita and the totals of refugees being taken into the country, to await being returned to their home nation or the safe country they arrived from. Just in terms of what is a realistic policy proposal, how does today's story reach your ears as someone who works in the sector?
Well, firstly, sending them to Turkey can't be done now. Because we're no longer part of the Dublin Agreement since Brexit, obviously, and we can't send them to any EU country.
Well, we could if they agreed. If Turkey agreed to take them, presumably in return for a fat check, then it could be done, but it can't be done as a legal instrument, is I think what you're saying.
That's it, yeah, and of course they can't be returned to the first safe country that they arrived in Europe or the EU,
no,
because we're not in the Dublin Agreement anymore. We left that as soon, on the 1st of January. So, places like Greece who have enough refugees, last time I sort of looked at the figures, I might be out of date. It's somewhere around about 150,000 or somewhere like that, just in refugee camps. Dotted around.
What about the idea that it's a question of where, if people successfully get here, Priti Patel seems to be addressing the challenge of, apart from here, where can we put them?
Yeah, so what's she going to do once they...
I don't know.
It's not like they all arrive in one go. And we talk about coming across the channel, but, there's lots of other ways that they come into the country as well. They're still coming on, well, not so much now during COVID, obviously.
That's why I've gone for the 2019 figures, because 2020 is going to have been quite anomalous. How do you feel? Part of me wants to ask how you keep your spirits up when everywhere you turn in this country, pretty much, is subscribing to this completely bogus perception that we are buckling under our burden and doing much, much more than our fair share. How do you keep going in the face of that level of cynicism and ignorance?
You just have to ignore it.
Yeah, it's easy.
You have to not read that stuff. But just as an example, because I know you mentioned Sweden. So last year, or the year before that, I went to Sweden to visit a family that I'd helped in one of the refugee camps, just to see how Sweden dealt with refugees. And it was amazing because the family were housed in a really nice apartment, and the system there was that first thing they have to do is learn the language. Now, Swedish not easy language to learn. I certainly wouldn't want to try and attempt it. And they give them 2 years to learn the language, and then they sit a language test, which, as long as the person who is going to do the work, as long as they pass that language test, they are then given the right to stay indefinitely.
Right. Among comparable countries, then, we're pretty near the bottom of the charts.
Well, I think we are at the bottom of the chart, aren't we?
And here we are, looking at a front page of the most popular newspapers in the country, which is suggesting that we need to clamp down harder on these people, even though we clamp down harder than any comparable country does. John, thank you so much. How has this happened? 0345 60 60973. Don't get cross with me. These are just numbers. I'm counting, all right? These are the facts, but of course the relationship between facts and feelings is never more strained than when it comes to the deliberate stoking of xenophobic and sadly very often racist feelings and fears. And a pretty asylum seekers to be sent overseas, which has come as news already to the First Minister of Gibraltar, who's responded to reports that Gibraltar might be one of the places that these asylum seekers are sent to be processed in the roundest of terms. Did you know that the First Minister of Gibraltar, I love this actually, if you were to ask the average punter, what they feel about Gibraltar. It's British, and it will stay British, and it's wonderful. Don't mention the fact that it's ended up pretty much in the Schengen area as a direct result of Brexit. And then I said to you, do you know the Chief Minister of Gibraltar is the leader of the Gibraltar Socialist Labour Party? I didn't know that. My apologies. Would the same people all have a hissy fit? I don't know, but he's certainly not pleased, Fabian Picardo. He's tweeted or written rather, a letter, and then tweeted the letter I have today written to Priti Patel, a good friend of Gibraltar. Lucky Gibraltar. To address reports in some media about UK asylum seekers being processed in Gibraltar. There is no truth to the reports. And a press release has been published accordingly, which I shall tweet from my account for your delectation now. I'll also tweet, because goodness knows you could probably do with a laugh, I'll also tweet a short film made by a comedian and impressionist called Tony Lapidus that I've got to tell you, it's absolutely brilliant. And I know it's a bit self-referential. I don't think it will work if I played it out on the radio, so I'm not going to do that, because you have to see it to believe it. Tony has done an impression of yours truly, which, if you're familiar with my clips, if you watch the show as opposed to just listening to it, I promise you, it's Mike Yarwood level of brilliant. It is frankly magnificent. And so if you want to find Tony, I'll retweet it shortly, but just look him up, Tony Lapidus, Lapidus, and it's just for a smile, all right? I'm not being Billy Big Bananas, it's just good for a giggle. 10:37 is the time. Back to the refugee question. How have we ended up in a political climate where voters think we've got a massive problem and we do way more than we should be doing, while reality teaches us that compared to most, or indeed all comparable countries, we do diddly squat? Hafsa is in St John's Wood. Hafsa, what can you tell us?
Hi, James. Thank you for taking the call.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, just like I told your producers, I think actually this is, it's part of continuation and decades of policy that has eroded both our desire to be more informed globally, whether it's about conflict or about the refugee situation, but also the policies get more and more extreme that our defense of them just becomes exhausting.
Yes,
so ultimately,
that's how I feel.
Exactly. So rather than a policy where people will never be happy, more of it is policies where people just become so tired of defending the rights of refugees and the rights, of our country to protect people and bring them in. And therefore, we just will keep doing our work quietly and
what do you do?
Moseying on along and stuff. I work in development and gender rights and refugees in the Middle East, North Africa, and Horn of Africa. Gosh. Most of the time.
So how do you respond to the accusation that the United Kingdom does shamefully little in this field from a governmental level?
Well, I spoke to the Swedish government for 3 years. During the refugee.
We're losing the phone line. So I'll give you one more
hear
go.
Me?
Yeah, just about.
Hello?
Just hello, Hafsa. I can't do that. I do apologise. We'll try and fix it for you. It can't be helped. But that was. I mean, just incredible. Have a crack at that, even if you think you're on the other side of this argument. And I know you probably find it slightly insulting, but if you're on the side of ignorance as opposed to knowledge, it doesn't make your feelings any less real, does it? It doesn't make you any less cross. This is good from David, who's in Cardiff. I think, James, for a lot of people in the UK, racism is a hobby. Getting angry about foreigners is an enjoyable pastime, and they'll happily vote for the party that'll best feed their hobby with a diet of fear and scaremongering. You might find that offensive, but it's also true. And of course the truth often hurts. So how do you think we've ended up in this place, this weird place, where we do very, very little, according to all international comparisons? But there's a very widespread and popular political lie suggesting that we do way too much. And for everybody still banging the population density drum, just talk me through how you can be in favour of sending these people to Gibraltar if it's the lack of space in the United Kingdom that compels you not to want them here. That would be Gibraltar, which is, the last time I checked, a rock. Ashish is in Croydon. Ashish, what can you tell us?
Hi.
Hello, mate.
I sense a bit of a double standard with the general public who are against refugees coming to this country. When Boris Johnson's government said that they would consider allowing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Hong Kong Chinese into the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't sense any outrage.
No, there wasn't any. I mean,
no.
And one should be broadly warm about the lack of outrage until you do the question that you're doing, which is what's the difference there? And I guess the difference is that you're talking about established relatively wealthy, successful is the wrong word, but relatively wealthy people who will be bringing money with them, as opposed to people fleeing war and famine. They're fleeing the totalitarian China's designs on Hong Kong, aren't they?
Yeah, but to the average knuckle-dragging racist, you know, they're foreign. You know, I mean, they won't care how much money they've got. They're different.
You know, I indulge in rhetoric like that myself all the time, but I still balk slightly when other people throw it back at me. If you know and I know, give me 20 minutes and I could turn them against the Hong Kong refugees as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, but I
Just get Nigel on line 7, will you? We could do it. We could do it by the travel news.
Yeah, but I think also more sinisterly, because the public have been fed so many stories in the right-wing press about sex grooming gangs and Islamic terrorism, I think
both of those are real. There are grooming gangs made up of predominantly Pakistani men, and Islamist terrorism is real. So the right-wing press hasn't invented it. It might over-report certain types of crimes when they're committed by a certain type of person compared to when they're committed by a different type of person. But you're right to make the link. I say asylum seekers, someone else hears grooming gang.
Yeah, so I think even though, obviously, you have all these stories, I think the public are more scared of the smaller numbers of asylum seekers who are coming from the Middle East, primarily because of their faith. I think they're differentiating the types of people coming here, and that's why there was no outrage when potentially millions of Chinese could come into the country.
I think 300,000 was the upper limit. Again, I feel like I'm splitting all your hairs, but it's not millions.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? Why would you be comfortable with a Hong Kong Chinese refugee fleeing Chinese designs upon Hong Kong, a refugee technically in that sense, very much so, and not comfortable with someone coming here from Syria? I guess you provide an answer to the question, and of course, just to withdraw from some of my pedantry, it is of course the right-wing media that very deliberately conflates issues like terrorism and grooming gangs with asylum seekers. So there are recorded instances of asylum seekers having undertaken acts of terrorism, but I don't think that the grooming gang issue plays into that at all. And of course, the way these things get reported, well, your chum's in the news again this week for allegedly nicking a lot of the money that was sent to him in donations. Becky is in Dover, appropriately enough. Becky, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Becky.
I spoke to your
Mum?
Your people. I'll say you about my mum. My mum comes from St Helena. My mum's family come from St Helena, and I was brought. I was born here in England and live in Dover. I've lived in Dover all my life, and so I support what's happening with the refugees. But I think the biggest problem is that we mask our miserable historical record on how we view and deal with people from other countries, even though those people, to all intents and purposes, believe themselves to be British.
This is the post-imperial. This is the problem of post-imperial Britain, rather than Middle Eastern asylum seekers.
But it still lives within our culture.
No, it does. And Satnam Sanghera has written an absolutely brilliant book about it, Becky, that you must read, called Empire Land. But if we use Syria as an example, because it's one of the most blighted parts of the planet, your average Syrian doesn't think he's British. There's no imperial legacy.
No,
explaining that.
But then that is what feeds the culture. That says that foreigners are to be feared.
Yes, and then you find an example of a foreigner doing something fearful, and somehow you can extrapolate from that a suspicion or a fear of all of them, which is, of course, the English translation of the Greek words that make up xenophobia. Becky, I've got to crack on. You know, in 1983, UK officials were discussing the possibility of resettling 5.5 million Hong Kong Chinese people in Northern Ireland. This is at the height of the Troubles. So, there's nothing new under the sun, it is often said, isn't it? So let's go back to this question of why. And I guess I should have perhaps phrased... No, I don't think I should have done, but I do hate the idea of immobility, as you know, of intransigence. So is there something that could change your view on this issue? Because you are being constantly told that the United Kingdom is a soft touch, or is doing more than others, or is, taking way more than other countries are. It's categorically untrue. Does that actually move your needle? Does reading out these numbers, these statistics, make you go, crikey, how did I end up believing that we were a soft touch? So I don't think I can help you if you're in the camp that says, no, they can't come here, we're too small. And then I say, well, what do you think about the idea of sending them to Gibraltar? And you go, yeah, I love it. Because that, obviously, I can't reason with that kind of position. We're too small, but Gibraltar isn't. But people who are capable of changing their minds, and you're presented with evidence that someone has been misinforming you and getting you concerned and frightened about something that isn't true. It's like one of Farage's posters, isn't it? I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I probably should try harder to acknowledge your existence rather than presuming that everybody is doing what, of course, we mentioned quite a lot on the programme, welded to whatever position it is that they were holding a month ago. Simon's in Liverpool. Simon, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I listen to you a lot, but I've never had the opportunity to speak to you before, so it's a bit of a Thursday morning treat for me.
There you are. Welcome. Better late than never, Simon.
Yeah, exactly. No, I listen a lot, but not been on. But no, I was just really interested when you started the show there with those stats, because, you've sort of pre-positioned it and introduced it. I thought this will be interesting. I'm curious to find out, because in my perception, I was perceiving that we probably are relatively high for asylum, and then it turns out we're not. And what was interesting to me was that I'm sort of not one of the people who gets angry and outraged about asylum. I'm quite cool with it. I think it's a humanitarian obligation, but I still had that perception. Yes. And I thought it's interesting that if you'd had, say, let's put it down to two people. If you got me sat in a room and somebody who is outraged and angry about the situation or the perception of the situation, although we react differently and feel differently, we still share that perception. Even people who are sort of on my side probably have the same perception, and I was just really interested that it's a false perception, probably one that's shared by people on all elements.
That's a brilliant point, and it adds to that sense I just tried to convey of having to acknowledge that this isn't quite as binary as it may sometimes appear. Because, like you, I think, certainly at some point, you've got to remember I do this for a living, but at some point in the last few years, I too have been surprised by the statistical reality of what we do as a country and what I thought we did, because, well, all of the newspapers that I've got in front of me create a false context, don't they? And the other thing, I know you'll have lots and lots of callers, so I'll make it really quick, but the next obvious question is why? Why do I share that perception with somebody who feels so different? And your producer, your colleague just before I spoke to you said, well, what do I think the answer is? Yeah. And the short answer is... That's good. I've got to go. Can we keep him on the team? That was a great question for us.
And the short answer is I don't know, but I did wonder, I don't know how you feel about it. Is it because in our conversations with each other, I feel like we often fail to distinguish between sort of legitimate immigration, legitimate asylum, which let's remember is legitimate, and illegal immigration. It all gets rolled in the same pot, and people fail to distinguish, and that's why where this perception of a foreigner is a foreigner, a foreigner is a foreigner is a foreigner, or an incomer is an incomer is an incomer. I guess that's got to be part of it, and also the camera crews on the White Cliffs of Dover. It works. It's selling tickets for the ghost train. It's incredibly powerful, emotive reportage to say you're under attack, you're under siege. It's no different, really, from Donald Trump promising to build a wall across the whole of Texas and Mexico. It works. If I tell you you're under threat, this is the thing, Simon. I don't know whether you'd agree with this. If I tell you that you're under threat, if you run for the hills, that doesn't actually make you a racist. Sadly, you weren't under threat at all. I was lying. But you ran for the hills rather than checking. Arguably, stopping to check could be stupid. Running for the hills could be the sensible thing to do, because I might have been telling the truth. Well, I think there are three people involved in that conversation, or that story, that narrative, if you like, that you told there. One is the government, one is the media, and one is the people on the receiving end of the information. And all three have got an obligation. You alluded to the fact that some of this stuff is a vote winner. Yes. And again, you go back to Trump. Yes. And we've got an obligation with the media. Again, there's a danger of lumping everybody in one sort of category. There's brilliantly responsible media outlets that are very sort of balanced
and small.
So there's there's an obligation in the media, but us too. Like you say, if you tell me I'm under threat, I think each individual's got the obligation not to just not to just soak that up and to check it out before you start reacting, because the reactions can be dangerous and harmful.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're obviously on a very similar page, including the probably the scales dropped from my eyes a little earlier than they dropped from yours, but the polling on this is incredible. It usually appears under the headlines, deliberately provocative headlines like the British public is wrong about everything. But when you look at the reality and you look at what people think, particularly in the context of all elements of immigration, legal, illegal and refugee issues, then almost all of us are completely skewed on this. And the answer is relatively simple, of course. It is because we're constantly being told that we're under siege, we're under attack. There's, that we've reached breaking point. It's incredibly powerful. It wins referendums, it wins elections, and it makes deeply unpleasant people famous. But, what do you do when the reality emerges? Unfortunately, a lot of people just double down on their anger and re-embrace their ignorance. And I don't know what to do about that. Maybe stop using words like ignorance. Andrew is in Hay-on-Wye. Oh, man, that hurts. That hurts, man. Seriously. Imagine having a book out in a year where the Hay-on-Wye festival isn't going to happen.
Have you got a book out?
I should mention it more. Thank you, Andrew, for that opportunity to mention that. I believe the paperback's coming out in May, but normally I'd be doing Hay-on-Wye and with such a bounce in my step. I'm using up all your time. What did you ring in to tell me?
But basically, it's about putting a face to, asylum seekers, immigration. Yes. So I'm in the middle of reading Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl.
Gosh.
And as heartbreaking it is, because you know what the outcome of it, at the end of it when they got picked up by the Gestapo.
Yeah.
But obviously they were German Jews, fled Germany because of the political situation. And the first country they landed in that was safe was Holland. Then obviously things developed and they were no longer safe in Holland, but they had nowhere else to go. They hide in a warehouse and, I think it was 2 weeks before his 16th birthday. I haven't got that far in the book, but obviously I know the history of it. And they get rounded up. But the sort of recurring theme throughout her diary is when it's over, where she's going to go. And part of the thing that sort of resonated with me a couple of nights ago, she wanted to go to Britain. She wanted to go to England.
Yeah.
And I think the perception of people when they're sort of fleeing, your life's been turned upside down, you've got to flee and get out of there. Let's go to Britain because they're a tolerant people. It's a great country to go to. And I really don't think that we are.
Well, we weren't then either. The work that Sir Nicholas Winton and others did on the kinder transport was not a government thing. It was private families sponsoring children who arrived. So politically, I don't know that you could have sold it. America, even more so, that the objection to the idea of refugees coming. So what changes in those decades? So nobody now in this country would read Anne Frank's diary. At least I hope so. I cling to my faith in human nature. No one would read that and think, well, we don't want her sort coming here, would they? And yet the modern equivalent of Anne Frank, who is currently, either living in a tent in Calais or hiding from the authorities in Syria, we're absolutely convinced we don't want them here. What happens in those decades in between? Is it the distance of history?
I'm not sure how it works. It's the way things are portrayed in the media. I mean, you've already highlighted it's a vote winner and it polls well to say there's the enemy at the gate.
But it wouldn't be a vote winner to say we don't want any latter-day Anne Franks coming here, do we? Clogging up our schools, nicking our jobs. That just wouldn't work. So how do people turn off that connection between the two?
But they're obviously not using Anne Frank as the example. They're painting asylum seekers. They're taking from you, in times of austerity, and we've all got to tighten our belts.
They're going to come here and fill their boots.
As green as it,
whereas what?
Yeah, they're going to take from you and send it home. Your benefit.
Coming over here, nicking your. Whereas most people you speak to cannot wait to get to work. Of course, we were supposed to Hassan Akkad, of course, very often on this programme, who when he couldn't carry on working as a filmmaker, having got here as a refugee, went to work as a cleaner in the hospital at the beginning of the outbreak. Did that change anybody's views on asylum seekers? I don't know, but if he had turned out, or if we found an asylum seeker who then went on to commit an act of terror, people will happily use that to paint everybody else with the same brush. It's just weird and very sad. Andrew, thank you. And I'll see you in Hay-on-Wye one day. I missed that little bit of Holly's bulletin there. Does that mean that, did she say Turkey and Gibraltar have now said they're not going to get involved in this asylum processing proposal. It's hilarious. How can it end up on the front page of the Daily Mail? Presumably as a result of a briefing from the Home Office mentioning places that have already said, not us, mate, not us, gov. And a quick mention to James Drew, who's kindly got in touch, said James O'Brien doesn't know how to have a balanced conversation. He hasn't had a single caller on that doesn't agree with him. Mate, you can't disagree with counting. Germany is the EU country with the most asylum applicants. Malta and Greece have the most applications per capita. The UK is really, really low down on the list. Malta, Greece, Luxembourg, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, Slovenia, Germany and France are all higher than us. That's not an opinion, James. Come on. You've been listening to this programme for a few minutes. You must have worked out the difference between counting and opinions. These are just numbers. You can't. If I say 2 + 2 = 4, you can't text in to say, God, I can't believe James O'Brien doesn't let anyone on the show who disagrees with him. All right, here's James. I think 2 + 2 = 5, James. Well, thank you very much for the call. You're about to go viral. I mean, what would be the point of that? Just be ridiculous. Honestly, sometimes I don't know why I bother. 7 minutes after 11. Time now to turn our attention to one of those subjects that I clumsily attempted to describe at the top of the show. Some of us will consider it to be one of the most important things on the planet at the moment, and some of us will consider it to be barely worthy of discussion. My job, of course, is to keep you on board if you're in the second category, while keeping you delighted if you're in the third.